Okay, so we're going to move on to Chapter 4 of Chris Hedges' The Death of the Liberal Class. This chapter is entitled Politics as Spectacle. And before I get to the title, I'm just going to say a few things about, well, first of all, Hedges generally, okay, and what he's doing in this book, kind of reflecting back on what we've been looking at so far. Friedrich Nietzsche said in The Use and Abuse of History for Life that there are these types of history that people do. Monumental history, which kind of puts up these great figures that people can emulate. They're heroic figures that often define a society. Antiquarian history, where people are more or less harking back in a genealogical fashion to the past to more or less grasp a hold of the traditions and values and ways of their ancestors, which can give them meaning. And then there's critical history, which more or less cuts things off at the root and uses history as a means of cutting off what no longer ought to live. And I guess I'd have to say that what Chris Hedges is doing in this book, in as much as he provides history, which he does quite a bit of, as we saw in the last chapter with World War I, he is providing critical history. It's history that's designed to cut off certain now malevolent things, as he understands them, at the roots, so that we can clear the ground and make something new. And so what we'll see going on in this chapter quite a bit is more of that. We will also see that he gives us a little bit of the history of why the New York Times let him go, which is interesting. We visited that in the first the first video I did on just introducing Chris Hedges. He's a very accomplished guy, but he got fired at one point, so he does explain why, so that's interesting. And also he takes a pretty big swipe here in this chapter at artists and academics who are, I would say, playing it safe and engaging in what Jean-Paul Sartre called bad faith. And so more about that as we get into the chapter. So the title, Politics as Spectacle, is very telling, and there's a quote below it by Philip Roth about how entertainment perhaps is the purpose of life. And the two together give you an indication of what this chapter is about too, that in effect, in a lot of ways, politics has become a spectacle, meaning something to just watch and something to sort of be mesmerized by, but not to think deeply about. And again, then he goes back into some fairly in-depth history about how we got to that point. One thing he does pretty early on in this chapter is take a hit at the old style 1960s and 1970s, more or less protest culture and hippie class. And this is hard to take for a lot of people, and it's just another indication of the kind of counterintuitive way of thinking. But Hedges is clearing ground, like I said, and he's not going to shy away from criticizing people, even if he has some sympathies, certainly with the left. He's a left-leaning guy for sure, but he is just merciless in pointing out where the problems lie. So he says, protest in the 1960s found its ideological roots in the disengagement championed earlier by beats, that's beat poets such as Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, and William Burroughs. It was a movement that, while incorporated a healthy dose of disrespect for authority, focused again on self-indulgent schemes for inner peace and fulfillment. The use of hallucinogenic drugs, advocated by Timothy Leary in books such as Politics of Ecstasy, and the rise of occultism that popularized transcendental meditation, theosophy, the Hare Krishna branch of Hinduism, and renewed interest in Zen Buddhism and the study of the I Ching, were trends that would have dismayed the Wobblies or the militants in the old Communist Party. The counterculture of the 1960s, like the commodity culture, lured adherents inward. It set up the self as the primary center of concern. it too offered affirmative therapeutic remedies to social problems that embraced vague, undefined, and utopian campaigns to remake society. There was no political vision. Well, that's a pretty tough thing to say against the 1960s, hippie intellectual class, more or less, is what he's talking about here. Some of these names you may not be familiar with, but you can look them up. Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, William Rice Burroughs, Timothy Leary. Basically, what I hear him saying is that with the 1960s and 70s, which involved the drug culture and just a lot of new ideas, kind of a rebelliousness. It wasn't about trying to rescue the working class from anything. It was about sort of seceding in a very personal way, as in very individualistic, in some ways very materialistic, although not always, and there would have been a lot of like pushback to the idea that they were materialistic. But in a lot of the things that they did, there was a material dimension. They had to dress a certain way. Certain types of adornments, certain types of rides were cool and others weren't. And so, but I guess the most deep criticism here is that this counterculture, as he said, is like the commodity culture, lured inward. And that's a sentiment that he repeats later on in the chapter too. A turning inward, man turning inward, homo incurvatus in se, right? And in doing so, the people in that movement really kind of abandoned what Hedges would say was their core mission in starting out with this rebellion, which would be to change the actual living conditions of people beyond themselves. The majority of people who are just trying to make a living and get by. So further, he says the 1960s counterculture, like the counterculture of the Bohemians or the Beats, was always in tune with the commercial culture. It shared commercial culture's hedonism, love of spectacle, and preoccupation with the self. The spectacle is a term in particular that has a lot of significance. You can look up for yourself the Society of the Spectacle, and you'll see that there's a lot of resonances there. But in this case, he's talking about literally spectacle, as in, mass demonstrations, big, get-togethers of people listening to music, getting drunk, smoking, getting high, and just general, mayhem that was engaged in by a lot of people in the 60s, which when you think about it is just wasn't really all that useful, though there were a lot of words about, how people needed to be rescued and transformed, and their lives needed to be changed, and we had a concern for the poor. So he says the moral vacuum of the counterculture disturbed religious radicals. And one of them was Dorothy Day, which is one of Chris Hedges' heroes, the Catholic workers movement founder. But he says such as Daniel Berrigan and his brother Philip, the Catholic worker leader Dorothy Day, and the Reverend William Sloane Coffin, as well as stalwarts from the decimated Communist Party, and old anarchists such as Dwight MacDonald and Murray Bookchin. So in other words, real leftists were disgusted by the 60s counterculture movement because they saw it as, he doesn't use this term, but decadent, basically. So this set up that generation for being co-opted by those who had money to give them in the form of salaries and grants and perks and all sorts of things, because they really had not really made a change in themselves. They were rebelling, but they were rebelling within the system, so to speak. Still, in his view, mainly capitulating to the system of individualism, materialism, the idea of me first, sort of wallowing in pleasure, or yeah, basically, yeah. So again, that opened the door. We talked about this last time about how corporations and the government looked for ways to control and steer those in society who might pose an actual threat, right, to their power. And so they did this by means of cooptation. He says the iron control of the arts is vital to the power elite, as important as control of the political and economic process, the universities, the media, the labor movement, and the church. Art gives people a language by which they can understand themselves and their society, and the corporate power structure was determined to make sure artists spoke in a language that did not threaten their entitlement. Now here you get into some commentary that is particularly pointed. Hedges is not known for being real gentle about these things. He says, the liberal class, especially its most elitist and snobbish elements, was used to help distance art from the masses, portrayed as too unsophisticated and uneducated to appreciate or understand authentic artistic expression. Museums and their arrogant curators appointed themselves as the arbiters of high culture. These liberal institutions ruthlessly filtered out artistic expression that confronted or exposed the darker side of the power elite. So again, here we have a group of people who's been elevated. They can think of themselves as counterculture, as protesting, as pushing against, but by taking the, I'm assuming he's talking about the grants, both from the government and from private industry, so that they can show their works in museums and be at the, be feted at the latest major pate for the arts. They basically become controlled. They get cherry picked too, so the ones that will continue to maybe make statements to the general public that are understood will not be given those grants, and instead you will have grants given to people who paint an all-white canvas or put a crucifix in a jar of urine and call it art. Sorry. And so basically, this makes art inaccessible to the average person. It's interesting. It seems real edgy to people who are like totally conditioned to appreciate such things, but the average person is going to go, not only do I not like it, but it's offensive. And then the artistic community has been rendered, in Hedges' view, not very useful for change, even though in their minds they think, oh, I'm being so bold. We get more of this feel as we move along. He says the artist, like the specialist or the professor, is plugged into a system where he or she serves the interests and tastes of the power elite. The choice may be between high and low culture, but in each sphere, members of the liberal class dare not risk losing their prestige and employment by defying the structures of power. And those on the upper end of the cultural spectrum, the tenured professors and cultural critics, the lauded poets and art historians, speak and write only for one another, like medieval theologians. Well, that's pretty strong, and it's, in my view, pretty accurate, unfortunately. Professors, cultural critics, artists, art historians, all these people who have good minds, like a lot of other folks, but these are the people who would be more likely to provide social criticism, some pushback about what's going on, to give people a sense of, how they might think differently from what they're being told, so that they can become more independent citizens, are rendered basically not useful. Writing to each other obscure texts, painting things that cannot be understood, speaking in a language that's almost like a foreign language, using terms that are never heard in ordinary discourse. And this is what is rewarded. It's what gives people higher salaries when they're working for universities or museums or libraries. Hedges says, Quote, Ortega y Gasset, who is a great author, suggested that intentionally obscure art would be used as an implicit insult to the lower classes when direct slurs were no longer regarded as acceptable. It's interesting that he mentions that because I think he sees it as an insult. It's like the people who have done this, in effect, are practicing this bad faith that I mentioned at the beginning. From Wikipedia, I'll just read you what this means. Bad faith, from the French mauvaise foi, sorry, probably mispronounced that, is a philosophical concept utilized by existentialist philosophers Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir to describe the phenomenon in which human beings, under pressure from social forces, adopt false values and disown their innate freedom, hence acting inauthentically. So I think this is an example of that. Hedges is basically saying that they can tell themselves that they are doing some good. Meanwhile, though, they're really actually kind of looking their nose down at ordinary people and not being willing to communicate with them. So now we've gotten very, very far away in his mind from, the role of this group of people. But again, I'll digress a little bit on, where he may not have it all right. I think I mentioned last time we have television shows that are really good sources of social criticism. Very few people, we have a lot of disintegration in our entertainment, so each program has a smaller piece of the viewing public, but there's a lot of good stuff going on out there. But also in art, it all depends on where you're looking, and music as well. You can be exposed to only really bad things, art that's completely inaccessible and probably doesn't have any real meaning. You can be exposed to cultural garbage that truly is decadent, but if you're looking for it, you can be exposed to some really good art that causes you to question. But the problem is getting there and finding it and caring about it. So overall, I still agree with Hedges, but I think that he doesn't point out that some of the liberal class, or whatever, not even just the liberal class, but artists and authors and cinematographers and etc., are doing very good things that really do allow us to think deeply about our world. Oh, and here's the ultimate for academia. He says, by the 1980s, the political sterility of the New Left found its academic expression in the embrace of French post-structuralist literary and cultural theory. The charade of protest was matched in the university by the charade of radical analysis. French theorists such as Jacques Derrida, Jacques Lacan, and Roland Barthes were adopted by American academics who jettisoned the political projects that had influenced the work of the French academics, retreating instead into what they termed the science of language and meaning. They deciphered texts. They shifted Marxist analysis away from economic departments, most of which had been taken over by free market ideologues. So yes, now when I first got started in academia, everything was about people like Jacques Derrida and deconstructionism. And I have to tell you, it really was a bunch of gibberish, and it really doesn't have any direct influence on the rest of life. Although I will say that when you take a good look at what some of these authors had to say, and if you can possibly read them, you can get a sense of what's wrong and what's sort of like what's wrong with the world today. So I'm not saying they're not worth reading, but I will agree that they are inaccessible. He says, this is a quote from Russell Jacobi. He says, stripped of a radical idiom, robbed of a utopian hope, liberals and leftists retreat in the name of progress to celebrate diversity. With a few ideas on how a future should be shaped, they embrace all ideas. Pluralism becomes a catch-all. the alpha and omega of political thinking. Dressed up as multiculturalism, it has become the opium of disillusioned intellectuals, the ideology of an era without an ideology. Okay, I'm running long, so the only other thing I'll say is that Hedges does give us an explanation for why he was fired from the New York Times. He says he went to a university commencement in Rockford, Illinois in 2003, and he was asked to do the commencement address. And he went and gave a talk which hit real hard on our involvement in Iraq. So, for instance, he said, "We have forfeited the goodwill, the empathy the world felt for us after 9/11." And he quotes quite a bit from the speech, and then he starts talking about how the university audience reacted with great emotion. As he talked on, people started to get unsatisfied. They started to yell things like, well, God bless America, and just hooting and hollering and saying, no, no, who wants to listen to this jerk, etc. And then they cut off his microphone, and he had to be escorted out by police. He said one woman was crying, others were singing God Bless America. And he had to actually be escorted out by police officers, I guess probably for his own safety. So, again, gosh darn it, people in a university ought to be able to hear political points of view, left, right, and center, whether you disagree. And of course, they invited him, right? We've seen this time and time again. You ought to know when you're inviting Chris Hedges, you're not going to be getting feel-good pablum. That's obvious as a 2x4 to the forehead. You aren't going to get that. If they'd ever read anything he ever wrote, they would have known, this guy he's not like pulling his punches. So if you don't want him to come, don't ask him. And then to treat him like that, it's just not, in my mind, a university needs to be better than that. Whether we're talking about somebody from the right that offends many people, or somebody like Hedges from the left who was critical of the war. But this just goes to illustrate that at the time, as all this was just getting started, people's feelings were whipped up into a real frenzy about it. Almost everybody was being very patriotic. There was no consistent public criticism of the war from either the Democrats or the Republicans, of course not from the Republicans, or from anybody else that the media was listening to. So here he was. Well, in the wake of that terrible, I'm sure it was a terrible experience all around, he was criticized by Rush Limbaugh on Fox News and the Wall Street Journal and the Rockford Register-Star. And he says there was a headline in the Register-Star, "Speaker disrupts RC graduation." I think it was the people who were disrupting the speaker. Tolerance, people, that's basically, and common sense. Anyway, so then, in addition to that, though, he says the editors of the New York Times were furious. "I had crossed the line once too often. I had dared to feel, to make a judgment, and to think independently. I was called into the Times office and given a written reprimand, and, I don't know. I'm not going to be able to find exactly when he got let go here, or maybe he just decided to leave after that. But anyway, wow, as a journalist who'd done all these things, been all these places that he'd been, and a known quantity, definitely, invited to a university, getting heckled by people for basically condemning the war. And being he was pretty strident about it. But that's kind of what you get, and it's a university, and we really do, in my opinion, we do need to really be careful and practice tolerance. So, anyway, that's the end of that story, and, yep, I better stop now. I've gone long. So I'll see you next time. Bye.